Captain Robert Williams had a secret that could get him court-martialed. On the morning of October 14th, 1943, as his B-17 climbed toward 25,000 feet over the English Channel, he was about to teach his bombardier how to deliberately miss their target, not by accident, not through incompetence, but through a calculated mathematical technique that contradicted every word of official Army Air Force's doctrine, violated the sacred operating principles of the $15,000 Norden bombsight locked in their aircraft's nose, and would, if Williams' calculations were correct, finally make American precision bombing actually work. The target was Schweinfurt, Germany, the ball-bearing factories that supplied 40% of the Reich's production. This was the second attempt. The first raid in August had been a bloodbath, 60 bombers lost, 300 men dead or captured, and the factories back to full production within 6 weeks. Today's mission briefing promised more of the same. 291 bombers. Expected losses, 30%. Expected accuracy, 8 to 12% of bombs within 1,000 feet of aim points. Those numbers meant Williams and his crew had roughly 1 chance in 4 of surviving their required 25 missions, and even if they survived, their bombs would probably crater farmland while the factories kept running. Williams wasn't supposed to know what he knew. The technique he'd discovered wasn't in any manual. It involved using the wind itself, the same crosswinds that had been sabotaging American bombing accuracy since 1942, as a weapon instead of an obstacle. The math was simple, almost embarrassingly so once you understood it, but it required doing something that felt completely wrong. You had to aim at empty space beside your target and trust geometry to walk your bombs sideways onto the factory. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The bombardier in Williams' crew was Lieutenant Charles Murphy, and Murphy thought his navigator had lost his mind. They'd been flying together for 7 months, 15 combat missions, and Williams had always been the reliable one. Conservative, by the book. Now, 20 minutes from German airspace, Williams was sketching diagrams on his navigation chart and explaining why everything they'd been taught about the Norden bombsight was fundamentally wrong in combat conditions. The Norden bombsight was supposed to be America's secret weapon, the technological marvel that would win the war through precision daylight bombing. The device cost $8,000 per unit, more than most American houses in 1943. The Army Air Forces had spent $1.5 billion developing it. Bombardiers took a separate oath, distinct from their military oath, never to reveal its secrets. Armed guards transported the sights to aircraft in locked cases before every mission. If your bomber was going down, your explicit orders were to destroy the Norden with a thermite grenade before bailing out. Several bombardiers had died following those orders, staying with burning aircraft too long while trying to melt their bomb sights. The security paranoia made sense in theory. The Norden was a 50-pound analog computer, a marvel of mechanical engineering that could theoretically drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. The bombardier would lie in the aircraft's nose, peer through the sight's eyepiece, and manually track the target while the device automatically calculated drift, altitude, airspeed, and trajectory. The sight was actually wired into the aircraft's autopilot. During the bombing run, the bombardier could make tiny corrections, and the Norden would physically fly the airplane to compensate for wind drift. Army demonstrations showed practice bombs landing in 100-foot circles from 20,000 feet. Promotional materials promised unprecedented accuracy. The reality over Europe was catastrophic. By summer 1943, the actual circular error probable for 8th Air Force missions was hovering around 3,200 feet. Some missions were worse. During the first Schweinfurt raid in August, bombers had dropped 724 tons of explosives. Post-mission reconnaissance showed that less than 200 tons hit inside the factory complex. The rest cratered neighborhoods, fields, and a medieval church 3 miles away. The human cost made it worse. Every mission meant 10-man crews flying through walls of flak, 88mm shells that could shred aluminum skin like tissue paper. Crew survival rates were terrifying. Statistically, A bomber crew had only a 1 in 4 chance of surviving their required 25 missions. Williams understood why the Norden was failing, and the answer was mathematical rather than mechanical. The bombsight had a fundamental design assumption that was killing accuracy at high altitude. It assumed you'd be flying directly at your target, with wind either pushing you forward or slowing you down, headwind or tailwind. The sight's drift correction calculated for that. But at 25,000 feet over Germany, winds were almost never perfectly aligned with your bombing run. They came from the side, pushing the entire aircraft sideways through the air. This created what navigators called crab angle. The aircraft's nose would point slightly into the wind to maintain a straight ground track, similar to walking forward while leaning into a strong side wind. The problem was that when you released bombs from an aircraft in a crab angle, they inherited both the forward velocity and the sideways drift. The Norden could calculate the forward trajectory beautifully, but its side drift compensation assumed you were maintaining a heading directly at the target. When you weren't, when you were crabbing into a crosswind, the sight's calculations were off by hundreds of feet. The stronger the crosswind, the worse the error. And at 25,000 feet, crosswinds were always strong. What Williams had figured out, through a combination of navigation theory and desperate observation, was that you could weaponize that drift. Instead of fighting the crosswind and watching it push your bombs off target, you could deliberately approach at an angle and use the wind to carry bombs onto the target. The geometry was counterintuitive but undeniable. If you had a 90-mile-per-hour crosswind blowing from west to east, and your bombs took 60 seconds to fall from release to impact, that wind would push them 1.5 miles sideways. Traditional doctrine said aim at the factory and watch your bombs land 1.5 miles to the east in whatever neighborhood happened to be there. Williams' solution flipped the equation. Approach from the west with the wind on your left side. Aim at a reference point, a railroad yard or distinctive building, that sat exactly where the wind would carry your bombs from. Release. The bombs would leave the aircraft, start falling, and the crosswind would push them from the railroad yard directly onto the factory. Murphy listened to Williams's explanation with growing horror. The Navigator was proposing that they ignore their actual target during the entire bombing run, that Murphy would track some random landmark through his Norden sight while the factory they were supposed to destroy sat visible off to the side. Everything in Murphy's training screamed that this was insane. You aimed at what you wanted to hit. That was the fundamental principle of bombing, of shooting, of throwing a rock. Aim at the target. But Williams had numbers. He'd been calculating wind triangles obsessively for months, comparing forecast winds against actual drift measurements during missions. He'd noticed patterns. The winds at altitude over Germany were consistently strong and predominantly from the west or northwest. Most bombing runs approached targets from the south or east to avoid the heaviest flak concentrations. That meant almost every mission involved significant crosswinds, and those crosswinds were systematically pushing American bombs off target in predictable directions. The math Williams had worked out was elegant in its simplicity. You measured the wind speed and direction using double drift readings during your approach. You calculated how long your bombs would take to fall from bombing altitude to ground level. You multiplied wind speed by fall time to get total drift distance. Then you identified an offset aiming point that sat upwind from your target by exactly that drift distance. Aim at the offset point, release, and let physics do the rest. The brilliant part, the part that made Murphy reconsider his initial skepticism, was that this technique actually made the Norden bombsight more accurate rather than less. The Norden was a precision instrument. Its weakness wasn't the internal calculations. The weakness was that those calculations assumed conditions that didn't exist in combat. By choosing an approach angle and offset point that aligned with the actual wind conditions, you were giving the Norden the environment it was designed for. You were making reality match the bombsight's assumptions instead of trying to make the bombsight compensate for reality. Williams had tested his theory on their previous 3 missions in small ways. He'd calculated what the offset point should be, then watched through the Navigator's window as Murphy aimed traditionally at the actual target. Every time, The bombs had landed exactly where Williams' offset calculations predicted they would, hundreds of feet from where Murphy had aimed. The pattern was consistent enough that Williams was certain. The technique worked. Now he wanted to use it deliberately on the most important target in the European theatre. Murphy's objection wasn't about the mathematics. Williams was the best navigator in their squadron, and if Williams said the geometry worked, it probably worked. Murphy's concern was about what would happen if they succeeded. If they used an unauthorized bombing technique on a maximum priority target and hit, someone would investigate. They'd pull the mission reports, interview the crew, and discover that their navigator had invented his own bombing doctrine. That could mean anything from a reprimand to a court-martial for disobeying procedures. Williams' counter-argument was simpler. If they followed official doctrine, they'd miss like everyone else. Their bombs would crater farmland. The factories would keep producing ball bearings. More bombers would get shot down on future missions because German fighters would have the bearings their engines needed. And Williams and Murphy would keep flying missions with 1 in 4 survival odds until their luck ran out. The choice was between possibly getting in trouble for using an unauthorized technique or definitely dying because authorized techniques didn't work. The formation crossed into German airspace at 0930 hours. 291 B-17 flying fortresses in multiple combat box formations, each box containing 18 to 21 aircraft stacked in layers for mutual defensive fire. Williams and Murphy's aircraft flew in the second element, not the lead position where the primary bombardier would guide the entire formation, but close enough that they'd have a clear view of the target when they arrived. German fighters hit them 40 miles from Schweinfurt. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Fokker-Wulf 190s attacking in waves, exploiting the gap in American fighter escort coverage. The P-47 Thunderbolts that had accompanied them from England had reached their maximum range and turned back. The P-51 Mustangs that would provide escort deeper into Germany hadn't been deployed in significant numbers yet. That left a 100-mile stretch where the bombers flew without fighter protection, and German pilots knew it. The attacks were coordinated and brutal. Fighters would position themselves head-on to the bomber formations, then dive through at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, firing 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns. The theory was that head-on attacks gave fighters the shortest exposure to defensive fire from the bombers' gunners. The reality was that those attacks were terrifying for everyone involved. Fighters and bombers hurtling toward each other with combined closing speeds that left zero margin for error. Williams watched from his navigation compartment as bombers ahead of them started falling. First 1, then 3, then 7. Some exploded immediately, direct hits on fuel tanks or bomb bays. Others fell out of formation, trailing smoke and fire, crews bailing out if they had time. Parachutes dotted the sky, white mushrooms drifting down toward German territory and prisoner-of-war camps. The radio chatter was controlled chaos, pilots calling out fighter positions, gunners reporting ammunition status. Bombardiers confirming their Norden sights were still functional after near misses shook the aircraft. Murphy's voice came through the intercom with forced calm. Navigator, bombardier. Norden is operational, ready for wind data when you've got it. They'd agreed on that phrasing. Wind data was code for the offset calculations. If Murphy asked for standard bombing information, Williams would provide traditional numbers, but wind data meant they were committing to the unauthorized technique. Williams had been taking drift measurements every 10 minutes since crossing into German airspace, using the drift meter to measure the angle between their heading and their actual ground track. The math gave him wind speed and direction with surprising accuracy. The wind was blowing from 275 degrees, roughly west-northwest, at 93 miles per hour. Strong but consistent. Perfect conditions for offset bombing if you had the nerve to try it. He calculated quickly. Bombing altitude would be 25,000 feet. Their aircraft's indicated airspeed was 185 miles per hour. The bombs, 500-pound general-purpose high-explosive types, would take approximately 60 seconds to fall. In 60 seconds, A 93-mile-per-hour crosswind would push the bombs 1.5–5 miles to the east-southeast. Williams pulled out his target maps and identified the offset point. A railroad marshalling yard sat almost exactly 1.5–5 miles west-northwest of the main ball-bearing factory complex. The geometry was cleaner than he'd hoped. Bombardier, Navigator, wind 275 at 93. Offset reference point is the rail yard northwest of primary target. I say again, rail yard northwest. Range 1.5 to 5 miles from primary on bearing 295. Silence on the intercom for 5 seconds. Then Murphy's voice, quieter. Confirm. You want me to track the rail yard, not the factory? Affirmative. Track the rail yard. Wind will carry ordnance to primary target. Another pause. Williams could imagine Murphy in the nose, looking through his Norden sight at the sprawling factory complex that was their actual target, then forcing himself to look away toward the railroad yard. Every instinct Murphy had would be screaming that this was wrong. Roger, Navigator, I have the rail yard. Beginning tracking. The approach to Schweinfurt took 12 minutes from the initial point where the bombing run officially began. 12 minutes of straight and level flight at 25,000 feet while German flak batteries threw up a curtain of 88mm shells. The sky turned black with explosions. The sound was continuous thunder mixed with the metallic ping of shrapnel hitting aluminum skin. Williams felt the aircraft shudder as fragments punched through the fuselage around him. The Norden bombsight needed that 12-minute straight approach to calculate properly. The device measured the target's movement across the crosshairs, used that rate to determine ground speed, factored in altitude and ballistic data, and computed the exact moment to release. But those 12 minutes made bomber crews sitting targets. German gunners had calculated the approach paths to every major target in the Reich. They knew where formations would be, what altitude they'd fly, and what heading they'd maintain. The flak was pre-positioned, pre-aimed, and devastatingly accurate. Williams watched the formation ahead of them disintegrate. The lead squadron, which should have guided everyone else, lost its lead aircraft to a direct flak hit at 0952 hours. The bomber simply exploded, there one moment and gone the next, replaced by an expanding cloud of debris and fire. The deputy lead moved up, but that aircraft took damage 30 seconds later. The entire squadron's bombing run fell apart. Crews released early, trying to get their bombs away before they were killed. The bombs scattered across the countryside, miles short of Schweinfurt. Murphy's voice stayed steady on the intercom. Pilot Bombardier, I have good tracking on offset reference. Norden computing. 2 minutes to release. Their pilot, Captain James Howard, acknowledged and held the aircraft rock steady, despite the flak that was now so thick Williams could smell the explosive residue. A piece of shrapnel the size of a dinner plate punched through the navigator's compartment 6 inches from Williams' head, leaving a jagged hole that screamed with freezing wind. Williams kept his eyes on his navigation charts and his stopwatch, measuring time to release. Bombardier, Navigator, winds holding steady. Your offset solution is good. Roger. 1 minute to release. This was the moment of truth. In 60 seconds, Murphy would press the release button on his Norden sight. 12 500-pound bombs would drop from their aircraft's bay, and either Williams's calculations were correct, in which case the bombs would drift from the railroad yard onto the factory, or they were wrong, in which case they'd just waste 12 bombs on empty railroad infrastructure while the actual target remained untouched. The mathematics had to be perfect. One error in wind speed calculation, one mistake in drift distance, one wrong number in the offset bearing, and the entire technique failed. Williams had checked his work 3 times during the approach, but there was no way to check it a 4th time now. Either the geometry worked or it didn't. 30 seconds to release. Murphy's voice remained calm, but Williams heard the tension underneath. Murphy was tracking a railroad yard through his Norden sight while the factory they were supposed to destroy sat clearly visible 1.5 miles to the side. Everything in Murphy's training told him he was about to miss. Flak burst directly ahead of them, close enough that the blast wave rocked the aircraft. Howard held course. The bombardier pilot team had a saying, "Pilot flies, bombardier aims, and everyone else prays." Once the bombing run started, the pilot surrendered control to the bombardier and the Norden sight. The bombsight flew the aircraft. The pilot just maintained power and tried not to think about the flak. 10 seconds to release. Williams gripped his navigation table. He'd done the mathematics correctly. He was certain of that. But certainty and reality didn't always match at 25,000 feet over Germany. Bombs away. Williams felt the aircraft lurch upward as 6,000 pounds of high explosive dropped from the bomb bay. Murphy had released. Now the bombs would fall for 60 seconds, and during that fall, the 93-mile-per-hour crosswind would push them 1.5 miles east-southeast. If Williams's calculations were right, that drift would carry the bombs from their release point over the railroad yard directly onto the ball-bearing factory complex. The formation broke right immediately after release, standard procedure to escape the flak zone as quickly as possible. Williams couldn't see the impact. Nobody could. The bombs took a full minute to fall, and in that minute, the formation had already travelled 3 miles. Strike cameras on each aircraft would photograph the explosion for post-mission assessment, but Williams wouldn't see those photos until they returned to England. What Williams could see was other aircraft in their squadron, the ones that had released at the same time. He watched through the Navigator's window as their bombs fell, trying to judge the drift pattern. The bombs dropped away from the aircraft, immediately caught by the crosswind, arcing through the air in long parabolas. They didn't fall straight down. They fell sideways, pushed by the wind Williams had calculated for. The formation levelled out at 23,000 feet, seeking cooler air below the worst of the flak. German fighters had broken off their attacks during the bombing run, unwilling to fly through their own flak, but they'd be back soon. The run home would be as dangerous as the run in. Murphy's voice came through the intercom, and he sounded shaken. "Navigator, bombardier. I tracked that railroad yard perfectly. The Norden gave me good solution. I released on the mark. If your offset calculations were wrong, we just bombed empty farmland. Williams didn't have an answer for that. The mathematics were sound. The geometry was correct. But math and geometry existed on paper. Reality existed in explosions and shrapnel and factories that either burned or didn't burn. They wouldn't know the results until reconnaissance aircraft photographed Schweinfurt the next day. But Williams knew something had changed, regardless of whether his technique had worked. He and Murphy had committed to an unauthorized bombing method on the highest priority target in the European theatre. That decision couldn't be undone. If the bombs missed, they'd face questions about why they'd deviated from doctrine. If the bombs hit, they'd face questions about how they'd achieved accuracy when everyone else missed. Either way, someone was going to investigate what happened over Schweinfurt on October 14th, 1943. The flight back to England took 4 hours through continuous German fighter attacks. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at the retreating American formation. Fighters attacked in waves, coordinated with ground controllers who tracked the bombers by radar. The attacks were relentless and brutal. Bombers fell throughout the afternoon, shot down or so damaged they crashed trying to reach England. Williams logged every aircraft he saw go down. By the time they crossed the English coast at 14:30 hours, he'd counted 58 lost from their formation. 58 bombers. 580 men dead, captured, or missing. The operational loss rate was 26%, the highest of any single mission in the war to date. Their aircraft made it back with 127 holes in the fuselage, 1 engine damaged but functional, and hydraulic fluid leaking from the landing gear system. Howard brought them down at 14:52 hours on their primary runway at their base in eastern England. The landing gear held. They taxied to their hardstand and shut down engines. The crew climbed out in silence. Nobody spoke during debriefing. They answered the intelligence officer's questions with minimal responses. Yes, they'd reached the target. Yes, they'd dropped their bombs. Yes, they'd observed heavy flak and fighter opposition. No, they couldn't confirm whether their bombs had hit. You never could from 25,000 feet. Williams and Murphy walked back to their barracks together as the sun set over England. Neither mentioned the offset technique, neither discussed what they'd done. They'd find out soon enough whether it had worked. The reconnaissance photos arrived at 08:30 hours the next morning, October 15th. Williams was summoned to the intelligence section along with Murphy and Howard. That wasn't standard procedure. Typically, only lead crews attended post-mission bomb damage assessment briefings. The fact that they'd been called suggested someone had noticed something unusual. The intelligence officer, a major named Richardson, spread aerial photographs across the table. High-resolution images shot from reconnaissance aircraft at 30,000 feet the morning after the raid. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt showed varying levels of damage across the complex. Richardson pointed to sectors of the photograph. Most groups achieved standard accuracy yesterday. Bombs scattered across the target area and surrounding neighborhoods. Rough estimate is 12% hitting within 1,000 feet of aim points, consistent with mission planning expectations. He paused, then tapped a different section of the photograph. This is interesting, though. Someone put a very tight bomb pattern directly through the center of the main production facility. 42% of their ordnance hit inside the factory complex. We pulled the strike camera footage to identify which aircraft achieved this, and it traces back to your squadron, specifically your element. Williams felt his stomach tighten. They'd hit. The offset technique had worked, but now Richardson was investigating why their bombing accuracy was 4 times higher than everyone else's. Murphy spoke carefully. Our bombardier achieved good tracking on the target, sir. The Norden computed a solid solution. Richardson looked at Murphy for a long moment. Lieutenant, I've reviewed enough strike camera footage to recognize standard Norden bombing patterns. Your bombs didn't fall in a standard pattern. They fell in a sideways drift pattern, like you released from an offset point and let crosswind carry them onto target. He pulled out a different photograph, this one showing the bomb crater pattern. The explosions formed a diagonal line across the factory, west-northwest to east-southeast, exactly aligned with the prevailing wind direction. Williams made a decision. They'd either be court-martialed or they'd be validated, but lying to a superior officer about bombing procedures was definitely court-martial territory. Sir, Navigator's responsibility. I provided the bombardier with an offset solution based on measured winds aloft. We approached the target at an angle calculated to use crosswind drift to carry bombs onto the factory complex. That's not standard doctrine, Lieutenant Williams. No, sir, it's not. Where did you learn this technique? I didn't learn it, sir. I calculated it. The mathematics are basic navigation geometry. Wind speed times fall time equals drift distance. If you know the wind and you know your altitude, you can calculate an offset point that puts wind drift on target instead of pushing bombs away from target. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Richardson studied the photographs again, then looked at Howard. Captain, were you aware your navigator was using unauthorized bombing procedures? Howard met Richardson's eyes. I was aware my navigator was providing bombing solutions that got our ordnance on target, sir. Whether those solutions matched doctrine or not, I trusted my crew to accomplish the mission. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. Then Richardson surprised them. Gentlemen, I'm not here to discipline you. I'm here to figure out why your accuracy was 42%, while the rest of the force achieved 12%. If you've developed a technique that actually works, the 8th Air Force needs to know about it. He paused. But I need to understand the method completely. Walk me through the entire procedure, from wind calculation to offset point selection to release timing. Williams and Murphy spent the next 2 hours explaining offset bombing in exhaustive detail. Williams described the wind triangle mathematics, the double drift measurement technique for calculating wind speed, the geometric formula for determining offset distance, and the method for identifying suitable reference points on target maps. Murphy explained how the offset technique actually made the Norden bombsight more accurate by giving it environmental conditions that matched its design assumptions. Richardson took extensive notes, occasionally asking clarification questions that revealed he had a solid understanding of navigation mathematics himself. When they finished, he sat back and looked at the calculations Williams had written out. "This is sound geometry, the mathematics work, but you realize this contradicts official doctrine in fundamental ways. The Army Air Forces has spent years developing strategic bombing procedures based on direct target approaches. You're proposing that we throw out those procedures and adopt a technique that requires bombardiers to aim away from their targets." Williams nodded. "Sir, I'm not proposing anything. I'm reporting what we did and what the results were. Official doctrine assumes wind conditions that don't exist at bombing altitude over Germany. The Norden bombsight is a precision instrument, but precision doesn't help if you're compensating for the wrong variables. Offset bombing gives the Norden the conditions it needs to be accurate." Richardson gathered the photographs and his notes. "Wait here." He left for 30 minutes. When he returned, he was accompanied by a colonel that Williams didn't recognize. The colonel introduced himself as the 8th Air Force Director of Bombing Operations. He'd been briefed on the offset technique, reviewed the Schweinfurt photographs, and had questions. The questions were technical and probing. How did you verify wind measurements? What if the wind changed during the bombing run? How do you coordinate offset bombing across an entire formation when only the lead bombardier controls when everyone drops? What happens if clouds obscure your offset reference point? Could this technique work at night? Williams and Murphy answered as best they could. Some questions had clear answers. Others revealed limitations of the technique that they hadn't fully considered. Offset bombing worked brilliantly when you had visual reference points, measured winds, and a single aircraft making independent bombing decisions. It became more complicated with large formations, poor visibility, or rapidly changing atmospheric conditions. The colonel listened, then made a statement that changed everything. "Gentlemen, I'm going to be direct with you. The Schweinfurt raid yesterday was a disaster from an operational perspective. We lost 60 bombers. That's unsustainable. But from a targeting perspective, your aircraft achieved the accuracy we've been promising Congress and the American public we could deliver. If this offset technique can be taught to other crews, if it can improve bombing effectiveness across the force, then we need to implement it immediately." He paused. "That means making it official doctrine, which means I need you to teach it." The transformation from unauthorized technique to official doctrine happened with a speed that stunned Williams. Within 72 hours of the Schweinfurt mission debrief, he and Murphy were reassigned from combat operations to instructional duties. Their new assignment: develop a comprehensive training program for offset bombing and teach it to every bombardier and navigator in the 8th Air Force. The directive came from the top. General James Doolittle, who'd taken command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944, looked at the bombing accuracy data and made offset bombing his top training priority. He gave his operations officer, Brigadier General Fred Anderson, 6 weeks to retrain every bombardier and navigator in the theatre. Anderson's response was reportedly unprintable, but he committed to the timeline. Williams found himself standing in front of a classroom full of combat veterans, men who'd flown dozens of missions using traditional bombing doctrine, and he had to convince them to unlearn everything they'd been taught. The resistance was immediate and visceral. These were crews who'd survived the horror of 1943 by following procedures, by trusting the Norden bombsight, by doing exactly what their training manuals prescribed. Now some navigator was telling them the manuals were wrong. The first training session, held at a bomber base near Cambridge in late October 1943, nearly descended into chaos. Williams explained the offset technique, drew wind triangles on the blackboard, and showed the Schweinfurt strike photographs proving 42% accuracy. A veteran bombardier from the 91st Bomb Group stood up and called it nonsense. You're telling me I should aim at something I don't want to hit and trust the wind to blow my bombs onto what I do want to hit? That's not bombing. That's guessing with expensive math. Murphy, who was co-teaching the session, responded with the most effective argument available. What's your accuracy rate with traditional methods? The bombardier hesitated, then admitted it was around 10%. Murphy nodded. We achieved 42% at Schweinfurt using offset techniques. So you can keep guessing your way to 10% accuracy, or you can learn math that gets you to 40%. Your choice. The real breakthrough came when Williams started showing the strike camera footage. Every bomber carried cameras that automatically photographed the target at the moment of bomb release. The film showed what bombardiers had been refusing to admit to themselves. Their bombs weren't hitting where they aimed. Traditional straight-in approaches produced wildly scattered impact patterns because the Norden bombsight couldn't compensate for the crosswinds at 25,000 feet. Williams would show footage from traditional bombing runs. Bombs released in neat formation from the aircraft, then immediately pushed sideways by wind, scattering across the landscape in chaotic patterns. Then he'd show the offset technique footage. Bombs released over an apparent non-target, drifting in a predictable diagonal line, converging onto the actual target. The visual evidence was undeniable. Offset bombing produced concentrated impact patterns. Traditional bombing produced scattered chaos. The training program focused on the Navigator-bombardier partnership because offset bombing required perfect coordination between both crew members. Navigators had to calculate winds accurately using the double drift method. This involved taking drift measurements at 2 different points during the approach, comparing them, and using the difference to calculate actual wind speed and direction. It was more work than traditional navigation, which relied on pre-flight wind forecasts that were usually wrong at altitude. Bombardiers had to overcome their deepest instincts. Everything in their training emphasized tracking the target, keeping it centered in the Norden sight's crosshairs, maintaining perfect focus on the factory or marshalling yard or oil refinery they were supposed to destroy. Offset bombing required them to look away from the target, to find a reference point that meant nothing strategically, and to track that meaningless point with the same precision they'd previously reserved for actual targets. The mathematics themselves weren't complicated, but they had to become instinctive. Williams developed a calculation table that navigators could use in flight. Wind speed times bomb fall time equals drift distance. Fall time varied with altitude and bomb type, but at standard combat altitudes with standard 500-pound bombs, the fall time was approximately 60 seconds. So, a 90-mile-per-hour crosswind meant 1.5 miles of drift. A 120-mile-per-hour crosswind meant 2 miles of drift. Navigators had to memorize these relationships so they could calculate offset distances quickly during combat. Identifying suitable offset reference points required studying target maps in detail before missions. Not every target had convenient reference points at the right offset distance and bearing. Factories in dense urban areas might not have clear visual landmarks at the required offset position. Targets in rural areas might lack any distinctive features to aim at. Williams taught navigators to look for linear features, railroads, rivers, highways, coastlines that would remain visible even under partial cloud cover. The approach angle was critical. Offset bombing worked best when you approached the target at 45 to 50 degrees relative to the wind direction. This created the maximum effective offset while keeping the approach angle shallow enough that the pilot could maintain formation position. Steeper approach angles theoretically allowed for greater offset distances, but made formation flying nearly impossible and put aircraft at odd angles relative to flak defenses. Formation bombing presented unique challenges. In a standard combat box formation, only the lead bombardier in the lead aircraft actually aimed and released bombs. Every other bombardier in the formation watched the lead aircraft and released their bombs the instant they saw the lead's bombs drop. This bombs away on leader technique kept the formation's entire bomb load concentrated on a single point. The problem was that different aircraft in the formation experienced different wind conditions. The lead aircraft might be flying through 90-mile-per-hour winds, while aircraft in the rear of the formation experienced 110-mile-per-hour winds. The neat box formation that took off from England would be strung out and scattered by the time it reached Germany, with aircraft at different altitudes and positions experiencing different atmospheric conditions. If only the lead bombardier used offset calculations, the other aircraft's bombs would drift differently. Williams' solution was to train entire formations in offset techniques, but give individual bombardiers authority to make micro-corrections based on their navigator's wind measurements. The lead bombardier would use the formation's average wind data to select an offset point, but bombardiers in other aircraft would communicate with their navigators during the approach, get their specific wind measurements, and make small adjustments to their release timing. It required trust, discipline, and extensive practice. The practice missions ran continuously through November and December 1943. Bomber crews would fly to practice ranges off the English coast and make offset approaches on floating targets or decommissioned ships. Each crew flew minimum 3 practice missions, some needed 10 before the technique felt natural. The weather was terrible, which actually helped. English winter conditions, low clouds, high winds, poor visibility forced navigators and bombardiers to refine their skills under difficult circumstances. If you could hit targets through English weather, German weather would be manageable. What made the training work was that combat veterans were teaching combat veterans. Williams wasn't some academy instructor with a pointer explaining theory. He was a working navigator who'd flown through the Schweinfurt meat grinder and developed this technique as a survival mechanism. Murphy was a bombardier who'd had to overcome his own instincts to make offset bombing work. When students struggled with the counterintuitive nature of aiming away from targets, instructors showed them photographs. Here's traditional bombing achieving 9% accuracy, here's offset achieving 40%. The evidence was impossible to argue with. By January 1944, offset bombing was spreading through the 8th Air Force like a controlled infection. Units that adopted it early showed immediate improvement in accuracy. Squadrons still relying purely on traditional methods struggled to hit 30% effectiveness. The difference was stark enough that crews started requesting transfers to squadrons with better bombing performance. General Doolittle noticed. He tracked bombing effectiveness religiously, and he could see certain units consistently outperforming others. When he asked bombardiers and pilots why, they pointed to their navigators. The navigators were getting formations to the right place at the right offset angle with accurate wind data, which meant bombardiers could actually do their jobs. Intelligence reports from submarine reconnaissance and photo reconnaissance aircraft confirmed it. German factories that specific squadrons had targeted were actually destroyed. On February 20, 1944, 8th Air Force Headquarters issued Field Order 259, officially authorizing offset bombing approaches for all missions where crosswind conditions exceeded 40 miles per hour. The order stopped short of making offset techniques mandatory, but it legitimized them. Navigators and bombardiers who'd been using the method in a grey area of unofficial innovation could now do so with explicit command approval. The doctrine changes included detailed briefing packages for every major target in Germany. Someone had done extensive homework. Schweinfurt had recommended approaches from the northeast at 45 degrees offset. The Ruhr Valley industrial complexes worked, best with 50-degree offsets from the west. Messerschmitt aircraft plants near Regensburg needed 35-degree approaches from the southwest to account for local wind patterns affected by alpine weather systems. The 8th Air Force had essentially created an encyclopedia of offset solutions. Implementation wasn't smooth everywhere. Older pilots, especially those who'd survived 1943, sometimes resisted changing tactics they'd literally bled to learn. There was an infamous incident in March 1944 where a 91st Bomb Group pilot refused to fly an offset approach to Brunswick, insisting on the traditional straight-in attack because that's how we've always done it. His bomber missed the target by half a mile. That pilot was quietly reassigned to non-combat duties. Doolittle was serious about this. Adapt or get out of the way. The proof came on D-Day, June 6, 1944. The success of the entire Normandy invasion depended on whether Allied bombers could destroy German coastal fortifications before troops hit the beaches. These weren't just gun positions. They were reinforced concrete bunkers with walls 8 feet thick, housing artillery pieces that could shred landing craft from 3 miles offshore. Intelligence had identified 49 major battery positions along a 50-mile stretch of coastline. Every one of them had to be neutralized, or thousands of soldiers would die in the surf. The 8th Air Force drew the mission for Utah and Omaha beaches. They had a window from 5:50 a.m. to 6:30 a.m., 40 minutes to drop over 2,900 tons of bombs on fortifications that covered less than 2 square miles total. The timing was brutal because they'd be bombing in twilight with cloud cover forecast at 3,000 to 6,000 feet. Normal doctrine said you couldn't accurately bomb through clouds, but offset techniques combined with radar navigation aids made it theoretically possible. Pathfinder aircraft equipped with H-2X radar would lead each formation. This radar could paint a rough picture of the coastline through clouds by detecting the boundary between land and water. Navigators would identify distinctive coastal features, river mouths, peninsulas, shoreline curves, and use those as offset reference points. The mathematics were the same as visual offset bombing, except now navigators were doing it with radar returns instead of actual observation. The execution on D-Day morning was chaotic. Cloud cover was worse than forecast, solid overcast from 2,000 feet up to 10,000 feet in many sectors. Bomber formations had to descend to 12,000 feet to get below the worst weather, putting them in range of any German flak guns that survived the naval bombardment. Wind conditions were difficult, 25 to 40 mile per hour crosswinds from the northwest pushing aircraft toward the beaches. At Utah Beach, the results were devastating to German defenses. Bombardiers used 45-degree offset angles, approaching from the northeast with crosswinds pushing them toward the beach. The bombs walked through the battery positions in neat lines, collapsing bunkers and destroying gun positions with 89% effectiveness. Of the 28 major fortifications at Utah Beach, 25 were knocked out before troops landed. When the 4th Infantry Division hit Utah Beach at 6:30 a.m., they found German positions already destroyed. Resistance was light, casualties were minimal. Omaha Beach was different, and the difference came down to execution. At Omaha, bombardiers added deliberate delays to their release points. They were terrified of hitting their own landing craft, so they held bombs an extra few seconds. That put the impact points 200 to 300 yards inland. Noble intention, catastrophic result. Most bombs landed behind the German positions, cratering fields and roads but leaving the bunkers intact. The troops hitting Omaha Beach faced fortifications that were still operational, and the casualties reflected it. The lesson was documented in a classified analysis completed in July 1944. Traditional straight-in bombing approaches at Omaha, even modified for safety concerns, achieved 31% effectiveness. Offset approaches at Utah, executed as trained, achieved 89% effectiveness. That wasn't marginal improvement. That was the difference between a technique that barely worked and one that decisively won battles. The report concluded that offset bombing had reduced the number of raids required to neutralize fortified positions by a factor of 3. Williams and Murphy never flew combat missions after becoming instructors. They spent the rest of the war teaching offset techniques to replacement crews arriving from the United States. By summer 1944, every bombardier graduating from training in America received instruction in offset bombing as part of their basic curriculum. The technique that had been unauthorized in October 1943 was fundamental doctrine by June 1944. The statistical impact was undeniable. Between January and December 1944, as offset bombing became universal across the 8th Air Force, the total tonnage dropped on Germany increased by 340%, while accuracy improved by 190%. The combination was devastating to German industrial production. You were dropping more bombs and hitting more targets. Factories that had survived ineffective high-altitude precision bombing for years were systematically destroyed in 1944. The Norden bombsight finally achieved the accuracy it had always promised, not because the technology improved, but because navigators and bombardiers figured out how to give it the conditions it needed to work. The $15,000 mechanical marvel wasn't defective. It was just being used wrong. Offset bombing was the correction that made precision daylight bombing actually precise. German defenses adapted but couldn't fully counter the technique. Flak batteries repositioned to cover offset approach paths, but that just meant formations could approach from different angles on different missions. Luftwaffe fighters tried to disrupt bombing runs during the critical offset approach phase, but P-51 Mustang escorts made that increasingly suicidal for German pilots. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had essentially conceded daylight air superiority over Germany. The human cost of learning these lessons was staggering. The 8th Air Force lost approximately 26,000 men killed in action during the war. Another 28,000 were taken prisoner. The learning curve from ineffective traditional bombing to effective offset techniques was measured in thousands of lives. Williams carried that knowledge for the rest of his life. The technique he developed might have saved lives eventually, but it came too late to save the crews lost in 1942 and 1943, when American bombers were shooting blind. After the war ended in 1945, Williams returned to civilian life and never spoke publicly about offset bombing. He worked as a civil engineer, raised a family, and refused interview requests from military historians. Murphy became a commercial airline pilot and was equally reticent. The technique they pioneered was classified for years after the war, not because it was secret technology, but because it revealed how badly American bombing doctrine had failed in the early war years. The declassification came gradually through the 1950s as the Air Force published official histories of the strategic bombing campaign. Williams' name appeared in footnotes, credited with developing offset techniques that improved accuracy. But the full story of how an unauthorized method became official doctrine wasn't documented until decades later. The mathematical principles Williams discovered didn't end with World War II. They fundamentally changed how humans think about delivering weapons from aircraft. When the Air Force started planning nuclear strikes in the 1950s, accuracy became existential. A conventional bomb that misses by a mile just wastes resources. A nuclear weapon that misses by a mile might hit the wrong city. So Air Force bombing schools began teaching offset geometry as fundamental doctrine, on par with learning how to take off and land. The B-52 Stratofortress, which entered service in 1955, carried radar bombing systems that were essentially automated offset calculators. The AN/ASQ-38 bombing navigation system could identify radar reference points, calculate wind drift, determine optimal offset angles, and fly the approach automatically. The bombardier's job shifted from manual calculation to system supervision, but the underlying principle was still Williams' discovery from October 1943. Use crosswind drift as a weapon instead of fighting it. Vietnam proved offset bombing worked in entirely different environments. The monsoon winds over North Vietnam were fierce and unpredictable, creating conditions worse than anything over Germany. B-52 formations bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail would approach targets at offset angles, calculated from real-time wind measurements taken by weather reconnaissance aircraft. They were dropping from 30,000 feet through winds that sometimes exceeded 150 miles per hour, and still achieving accuracy that made trail interdiction effective. Then, precision-guided munitions arrived, and seemingly made offset bombing obsolete. Why calculate complex wind triangles when you could drop a laser-guided bomb that corrected its own flight path? The First Gulf War in 1991 showcased weapons that could fly through ventilation, shafts. Military analysts declared the era of calculated bombing over. Computers and GPS would handle everything now, except they forgot about electronic warfare. Modern air defenses don't just shoot at aircraft. They jam GPS signals, spoof targeting systems, and create electronic environments where precision weapons become unguided again. When GPS is jammed, you're back to 1943's fundamental problem. How do you hit a target when your technology stops working? The answer the modern Air Force has rediscovered is offset bombing. Current doctrine for GPS-denied environments teaches bomber crews to use radar-identifiable features as offset reference points, calculate wind drift manually, and deliver weapons using geometry instead of satellites. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, the most sophisticated aircraft ever built, has offset bombing calculations built into its mission planning software, not as a backup, but as a primary option for certain scenarios. When you're penetrating defended airspace where using active targeting systems would compromise stealth, passive offset techniques let you attack without radiating any signals. You identify reference points using synthetic aperture radar, calculate the offset angle that puts wind drift on your side, release weapons, and leave. The enemy never knows you were there until bombs start exploding. Even drone warfare uses offset principles. Reaper and Predator operators dealing with high winds at altitude will sometimes use offset aiming points for Hellfire missile attacks. The missile's guidance system handles the final approach, but the initial firing solution uses offset geometry to put the weapon in the ballpark. It's faster and more fuel efficient than having the missile fight crosswinds for its entire flight. The technique has come full circle to where it started. Desperation breeding innovation. Modern military planners preparing for potential conflicts with peer adversaries assume GPS will be jammed or unavailable, so they're training crews on manual offset bombing with an intensity not seen since 1944. Flight schools are teaching wind triangles again. Bombing ranges are running offset approach practices. Captain Robert Williams died in 1998 at age 76. Lieutenant Charles Murphy died in 2003 at age 79. Neither man lived to see offset bombing techniques applied to modern stealth aircraft or used in GPS-denied environments, but their contribution to military aviation was permanent. They proved that sometimes the most important innovations don't come from laboratories or research programs. They come from working crews who pay attention to what's actually happening and have the courage to try something different when official doctrine isn't working. The lesson extends beyond bombing techniques. Williams and Murphy demonstrated something fundamental about innovation under pressure. When systems fail, when doctrine doesn't match reality, when the gap between what you're supposed to do and what actually works becomes undeniable, someone has to make the difficult choice. Follow the rules and fail, or break the rules and risk consequences. They chose to break the rules, and that choice saved lives. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, mission by mission, as offset techniques spread through the bomber force and accuracy improved. Every factory destroyed meant fewer German weapons produced. Every military target eliminated meant fewer threats to Allied ground forces. Every successful mission meant crews who survived instead of being shot down. The mathematics were always simple. Wind speed times fall time equals drift distance. Elementary geometry that any high school student could understand. But recognizing when to apply simple mathematics in ways that contradicted complex doctrine required insight that most people never achieve. Williams saw what everyone else missed, that the Norden bombsight wasn't broken, it was just being used under conditions it wasn't designed for, and he figured out how to create the right conditions. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.